Buddy, good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Laura Greeley, Regional VP of IAB Southeast Asia and India. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our Revolve webinar series. This week, we turn our attention to retargeting in an evolving data privacy landscape. We take a look at smart strategies along with regional case studies. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Udipta, who's the head of sales for Southeast Asia of RTB House, and Aileen, who's the head of account management Southeast Asia for RTB House. This week, they're going to be working really hard to demystify some key questions that we are getting at the IAB around retargeting from both a demand and a supply perspective. We look at how retargeting has evolved in the region. Questions like how do clients split budget and allocate depending on unique objectives. We also look at some learnings from regional giant Zalora and local Indonesian superpower BliBli. We also then look at a supply perspective. What is the impact on yield for having multiple bidders who come to buy inventory? And then we take a future lens. With upcoming changes in data privacy laws, how could retargeting adapt and change in the future in this region? Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Aileen and to take us through today's presentation. Aileen, over to you.
Hi, thanks Laura for the introduction. And once again, thanks everyone for tuning in today. We are very excited to be here to talk about the retargeting space and what's going on in the industry. As retargeting starts to gain traction in the marketplace, we like to share findings, strategies, best practices for you to consider to optimize your spend. So without further ado, let's get started. So the retargeting space has been growing tremendously over the past years. In fact, retargeting is now considered a top 5 method to acquire customers. While the growth has been strong, we have not seen the same traction across all verticals. From the chart on your right, clearly shopping has been a strong advocate of retargeting and has been the key driver of this growth. While other verticals have not embraced this technique the same way that shopping has, with the current pandemic and climate, where people seek entertainment through gaming, streaming, music, and so on, we would imagine that these verticals will follow suit in 2021 and the years forward. As more brands start to use retargeting, and advertisers who are looking to enter into this space, that naturally the consideration is whether to go with one or many and what are the pros and cons to different approach. Naturally, there are many schools of thoughts. Some would imagine that running across multiple retargeters would result in cannibalization of your campaign due to duplication and wastages. On the other hand, there are strong believers who currently run multiple retargeters as they believe that multiple players are able to drive greater reach and efficiency for them. So let's take a look at what the players are doing in the marketplace. Clearly looking across the region, we see that brands are indeed engaging multiple retargeters. In fact, some brands even engage not one, not two, and some of them even engage more than 5 vendors. There must be a reason for doing so. So let's take a quick look as to why these advertisers are running with multiple players. When we look at the marketplace, we find that clients are able to achieve larger sales volume while maintaining the same ROI when they use multiple retargeters. This is especially so for clients who have open budget, because many times such clients' core objective is scale and volume. So why, when scale and volume comes into place, multiple retargeters work? It is the whole concept of diminishing returns. At some point, saturation point hits, scalability tapers, and performance starts to drop. It is at this point where a second or even third vendor running in parallel can help to expand the scope and reach of your campaign. So when we look at clients with close budget, we have we found similar trendings as well. There is indeed greater efficiency, and in fact, at the same budget level, a client is able to achieve higher ROI with the same budget, especially so when the duplication is small. So from the two scenarios that we have shared, we can clearly see the value of running across multiple players. But as to how a brand should allocate or shift your budget really depends on your business objectives, your campaign goals, and the available budgets. But the key thing to always consider during this allocation is really the percentage of duplication and the effects of diminishing return. So for now, I will hand over to Udi, who will share some case studies and how competition improves performance. Over to you, Udi.
Thanks, Aileen. So I think let's break down some of the benefits of this multiple retargeting strategy. I think the first benefit is that competition improves performance. So if you look at any marketplace, there are always two players. You have the business and you have the customers. A business wants to have control over the market and restrain the competition, whereas the customers, they want more options and the best product and service for the lowest price. So in a free market, the latter has always been the winning case. As the father of economics, Adam Smith, mentioned, limiting competition always conflicts with public interest. So here we're going to look at, we're going to do some guesswork. So there's going to be a poll available to you coming up with 4 options. And I want you to guess how much a mobile phone cost in 1983. And you'll get to see the answers in a few seconds. So let's start the poll. Right, so the correct answer to this, as we'll see now, is 3,995. And as you would expect, that thanks to increasing competition, which led to faster innovation, phones have got really cheap really fast. There is a bump from $350 to $600 around 2007 and 8, and that's obviously because of the launch of the iPhone. But again, from that point onward, thanks to competition from Android, there are now more than 100 smartphone manufacturers in the world, with flagship phones going at around 300 to 400 even. It's a similar story with any industry, where most brands that we use today regularly did not even exist about 20 years ago. For example, in transportation, you have Uber, Grab, etc., who have eliminated the dominance of corporate taxis, improved accessibility, digital experience, and the quality of service. You also have the players in the finance sector like PayPal, Revolut, etc., which has made banking more agile and friendly and accessible. And in the travel industry, you had the rise of the OTAs and the meta search engines, and in the recent times of the sharing economy with Airbnb, which has forced hotels to improve their service quality, adapt their prices, and also digital transform. So in the end, the winner has always been the customer. And for a second, if you imagine yourself to be the only player in the market, what would you do? You would obviously want to, keep your monopoly running and consolidate your profits. By that, you would put higher margins, focus on lower, R&D costs, and also lower your, customer service. This is obviously bad, and which is why competition, in the case of any industry, including retargeting, is a good thing. Because if you look at the case of the ad tech industry, I think this improvement has come in the form of better technology. For example, if you look into products which are expanding into advanced AI capabilities like deep learning, by giving brands and clients better UX for them to use the tools intuitively, and also provide better support with the availability of synchronous human support around the clock. So in summary, today's clients who are looking for any retargeting vendors have a wide range of solutions that meet their requirements. all because of the highly competitive nature of our industry. From our experience, having competition has been a good thing for Zalora, for example, because our campaigns rank alongside our competing vendors, and while our recommendation engines selected the users most likely to convert, ultimately it was Zalora which received an additional 500,000 sessions per month and significant improvements to its compounded monthly growth rate and return on ad spend. Similarly, BliBli saw an increase in their ROAS after we were added as a new vendor. So the 10% increase in ROAS came from without actually compromising on order volume. So which kind of further confirms the concept of using separate retargeters. And we've run similar scenarios across other markets and have observed that our clients tend to increase the scale of operations without losing out on the efficiency. Now, to explain the technicalities and what happens at the back end behind campaigns like these with multiple retargeters, I would like to hand over the presentation to Aileen now.
Thanks, Udi. So currently we have talked quite a bit about using multiple retargeters, mainly focusing on the buyer side. So now let's take a step back and look at from both a demand and supply perspective. Looking at the supply side, back in the early 2010s, it was entirely possible for a retargeting vendor to bring unique or even exclusive access to a specific publisher inventory. However, today, with the revolution of real-time bidding, most vendors today effectively uses the same SSP and mostly have the same access to the same kind of inventory with very minor variances on the supply side. As a result, inventory today is no longer a major key differentiator when working with a retargeting partner. Contrary, on the demand side, there are many bidders. But what is different is that all these bidders have a different technology, a different algorithm, and a different AI models, which effectively differentiates the performance and effectiveness across different vendors. Every bidder evaluates the inventory differently. They value each user differently. That is where you saw at the Venn diagram, where sometimes the duplication is small and it's able to drive incremental reach. And that is also because fundamentally the bidder is different and it thinks that different users are of different value, and hence it could reach out to an unduplicated base to drive the performance for the advertisers. So having looked at the demand and supply side of things, because each bidder works differently, running across multiple retargeters will clearly help your brand drive greater reach and efficiency, as you can see from the Venn diagram. So what more on the inventory marketplace front? If you're worried about multiple bidders jacking up the price, first price auction model has become the market standard with wide adoption. There has been quite a bit of misconception in the marketplace that multiple bidders drive up prices. But with this new model, it in fact limits overbidding. So how is this so? In the first price auction, you pretty much pay for what you bid for. In the past, for second price auction, you pay 1 cent more than the second highest bid. In reality, because of this loophole, bidders then may arbitrage by bidding higher, knowing that they won't have to pay the highest price anyway. But with this new model, it forces bidder to enable precision in bidding to bid exactly the price that you are willing to pay and exactly what that inventory is worth for. As the bidders out there are trying to tweak their algorithms to fit this new first price auction model, this will eventually result in cost neutrality rather than effectively bringing up the price of inventory. So next, I'll be handing back over to my colleague Udi, who will walk you through how multiple retargeters work together efficiently and the best practices for brands who wish to adopt this approach. Over to you.
Yep, so in this section, we're looking at how having multiple platforms running simultaneously has a synergistic effect, both from a concept and also looking at some of the data. So if we zoom out from the domain of ad tech into the larger retail world, let's imagine in our hypothetical store, we have two salespersons working side by side, and they have very different selling styles. So all customers will typically fall under one of four categories. You have the ones who bought after interacting with the first salesperson. You have the ones who bought after interacting with the second only, and then you have the ones which bought from the first because the first salesperson is trying harder now in the face of competition, and vice versa. And then you also have the ones who bought after the combined effort of both the salesperson. In the world of retargeting, what we found is it works rather similarly. Now, as Aileen discussed earlier, different retargeting platforms work very differently because they have different algorithms, recommendation engines, audience selection, and creative management systems. So keeping that in mind, users who convert from your campaigns can also be placed under four buckets. You have the ones which engage only from one retargeter, then the ones who have only interacted with the second retargeter, and obviously the ones which have interacted with the first, but that's only because the first retargeter dropped its margins to reach a larger audience. And finally, you have the ones which have engaged with both the retargeters which were working side by side. Now, one of the main concerns of especially the last point is overlapping of bids, and this does happen. And a lot of brands tend to talk about this as a concern. But what we found from our data is that on average, only 22% of the bids that that the user is being exposed to in a way are having overlap. So what that means is that like a staggering 78% of users that have been reached out have been done so without having any overlap between the two platforms. We've also found that about 30% of the users, only about 30% of the users have a relatively straightforward path to conversion. So in this case, typically a scenario would be they see a prospecting banner, they go to the website, see a retargeting banner, come back to the site and make a conversion. But for about 70% of users, the path to conversion is far more complicated, and they typically tend to bounce across multiple touch points before making a purchase. Google research has shown that touch points can range from like 20 to 500 depending on the type of product and industry. And if you remember, we mentioned earlier that each vendor has its own bidding tech and audience selection methodology. So what conceptually happens here is that having multiple vendors ensures that if one of your retargeting vendors misses out on a user, there is a high probability that another vendor will catch them in the funnel. And with a bid overlap of 22% on average, I think there's definitely more upside to this than downside. So if you are a brand which is planning to give this strategy a shot, there are quite a few things to know before you get started. And let's start with some of the tips that we can provide. Starting with that, if you are going to test an additional vendor, make sure that you test only one additional one at a time, because this is to decrease the risk of errors and also to decrease the capacity to make sure that your team doesn't get overwhelmed with multiple deployments. Second is to have, if you want to have a fair result, it's important to give each vendor consistent budget and targets. If you put additional pressure on one of the vendors, let's say the new one, then the incumbent will look better, but that's going to be just an artificial improvement in performance. Number three, it's important to centralize the attribution mechanism. I think typically you would want to set these up on any analytics platform or mobile measurement partners, because then they bring in the auto deduplication. And lastly, this is really important, is when you run a campaign for a new vendor, it's important to run the campaign over twice the duration of the cookie window. This is because this is to ensure that the incumbent vendors, they don't get an unfair advantage by reporting residual conversions, which have been acquired from clicks before the start of the comparison. But once you have the cookie window covered, the new vendor would be tracked fairly. Again, while we've talked about all the benefits, multiple retargeting strategy is not a silver bullet, and brands need to be aware of some of the drawbacks of this strategy. The biggest issue that you may come across is bid overlap. We've shown you earlier that on average, there's 22% bid overlap between two vendors. At that point, campaigns can still be profitable. But if the scope of the targeting that you have is narrow, if the product is too niche, or if the touch points to conversion is too short, then the likelihood of bid overlaps increase to the point where the entire exercise becomes inefficient. So you need to be aware of that. Secondly, I think I've mentioned this earlier, but the data should always be measured and verified on a third-party analytics platform to deduplicate the results. And lastly, this is an issue which affects a much more broader spectrum of the industry, but today brands are not able to optimize across vendors because there is no unifying system which binds them together. So it makes it difficult to find an optimal frequency cap. Our recommendation is to test out various levels of capping on each of the vendors to find out which is giving you the most optimal returns. So looking at what's coming up, we've covered what the state of retargeting is today. So what's coming up next? We can talk about plenty of things here, things like artificial intelligence to CDPs, creative management systems. But if we were to look at what's coming up immediately, I think it boils down to two areas. One is the impact of the universal ID. So what is a universal ID? It's a unique identifier created by a set of prominent ad tech consortiums or companies to provide a shared identity of the user across the ad tech supply chain without syncing the cookies. A simple analogy of this will be like having a mobile ID, but for browsers and web. In our view, it's still early days with this, as the entire ad tech industry has to come together to accept one standard. And right now, the efforts are scattered with no timelines in sight. We also know that privacy is of concern in our industry, and therefore Apple and Google have both brought in stricter measures with updates to their operating system and browsers respectively. So for the retargeting industry, these will have a profound impact on how users are synced across multiple sessions and devices. There are many solutions being worked on. An example would be AppsFlyer's aggregated attribution, which relies more on probabilistic targeting versus deterministic. But and many vendors may go down that path, but at this point, it remains to be seen where the industry goes into as a whole. So, just to summarize, to look at, let's take a reminder of what we've discussed. So, number one is competition improves your performance. So, having multiple vendors could be a good thing for you. An additional retargeter helps you win auctions. And finally, the combined efforts give better results. So with that, we thank you for your time and hope you have found some useful takeaways from this. I'm handing it back to Laura now to take it forward.
Great, thanks, Udi. Thanks, Aileen. So I'm going to switch on both of your cameras and I'm going to take us through the Q&A that we've got loads of questions that have come in. So I'll leave it up to both of you to decide who's going to take which question. But let me go through them in no particular order and I'll leave it with you. So I think so the first question, sorry, I'll start again. How do you as a client make sure that vendors don't duplicate or overlap with your target audience? Is there any kind of particular tips that you would have? Udi, do you want to take this one?
Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions. Which question is it again? Do you mind repeating?
How do you as a client make sure that the vendors don't duplicate or overlap with your target audience?
Yeah, so as I mentioned during the presentation, this is actually a problem which is affecting the entire industry, not just retargeting. However, in many situations, like for example, you can use when you use an ad serving platform, that's a Seismic, they have certain solutions where you can kind of put a frequency cap across the vendors that you're tracking through that one system. However, the problem is sometimes when you run, for example, certain ads on Facebook, those may not be able to be served through that system. So you can control that situation to some extent, but I think unless we have like a universal ID in place, this problem will not be solved at this point of time. The best thing is to trial and error for your campaigns and see what works best for you.
Got you. Trial and error. Perfect. So, well, I think you brought it up, so I'll go with it. How do you plan on retargeting in a cookieless environment? I don't know which one of you wants to take that.
Okay. Yeah, I can take. So I think it's going to be a challenge, obviously, but as I mentioned about, let's say, AppsFlyer coming up with the aggregated attribution model. Now, if you go through the details, essentially you can see that the system in the future has to be so good to the point where it doesn't really need deterministic signals to understand which person to retarget. So I think there'll be a point in the future where your probabilistic way of retargeting would probably achieve almost the same kind of efficiency as deterministic. And I think that is one of the ways in which this is being looked at. However, if you look at the different projects going on in the Chrome sandbox environment right now, there probably will be another kind of indicator which is going to replace cookies, but we don't know the full details of that yet. It's something to look out for. But I think there's going to be some kind of solution to this which will have similar capabilities as cookie, and while removing some of its drawbacks at the same time.
Okay, got you. Thank you so much. Aileen, I might throw this one to you. Does multiple retargeting vendors work for mobile apps? Oh, sorry, I've not got you off mute. Wait 1 second. You're off mute now.
So multiple retargeters would also work for the mobile app world. It's not just only for the web and app. So pretty much, actually, there's a misconception in the retargeting space that many things that running retargeting in web and app is very different. Effectively, they are actually very similar. The only difference is in mobile apps, the inventory is mostly targeted within the apps, and we look at the device IDs things. So no difference in working across web or app. So it applies for that as well.
Got you. And I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this one, but Rachana has asked, considering that most of them access a similar pool or the same AdX/SSP, if the KPI given for a particular campaign is maintained the same, how much difference will be the algorithm to get different audience? So I think this is a question relating to how do the algorithms maybe differ?
It really depends. Basically, in order to get a different audience, there's no hard and fast rule. As Udi has shared, it's more like a trial and error. But what we can do is, while every bidder pretty much have the same access in terms of their SSPs, to be able to reach out to a different audience, one way is a trial and error. And from there, we can look at, do some overlap analysis. Typically, for some vendors, some brands, they will look at the entire click chain data to see the entire conversion path. So as Udi has shared earlier on, there are about 30% of the users will convert with a certain exposure, 70% requires multiple exposures. So as to whether you will reach a different audience really depends on the bidder algorithm. They will look at, some algorithms will look at conversion rate, some will look at CTR, some would even look at the conversion value. So because of the differences in all these vendors that look at different parameters, even though it is the same inventory, that bidder may not bid for that user, whereas a different bidder would think that that user is relevant for that brand and still bid it, even though another bidder may think otherwise. So as to how you would effectively see that difference, it is running through a campaign a bit by bit. So that also goes to the best practices as to when you add one retargeter, you usually try to add one at a time. Look at the duplication, decide whether that duplication percentage is reasonable within the industry average of, say, about 22%, or if that duplication is big. If that duplication is small, which is typically what we see in the marketplace, then that's where you can determine whether you are reaching out to a different audience or not.
Got you. Got you. Just you had mentioned attribution, which I think was quite interesting because we do have a question which is asking, is there a way that we can find the right attribution window for retargeting? Have you got any tips around that?
Sure, I'll take that question. So there is no hard and fast rule. There are some players that look at 30 days or 7 days or even 1 day attribution. What is essential is every brand has a different attribution window. It is essential for a brand to look at your user base to see what that time to conversion is. So generally, let's say if you target a user, they may take 1 day, 7 days, 10 days to convert. You can look at that chart and plot out to see whether it is like 10% that convert on the first day, or is it 70% of your user that convert within that day. So one of a general guideline we sometimes advise is, we look at least 70 to 80% of the converted user. We look at that time to conversion. If it's at least 80% of the conversion happens in, say, 10 days, then the attribution would be 10 days. If let's say 70, 80% of the conversion indeed happen on 1 day, then the attribution could even be as narrow as 1 day. So it really depends on the user base and the products that is being marketed. Because generally, a high value product would usually take a long time to convert. Hence, you need a longer attribution window. But let's say if in a pandemic these days where you are just selling masks or low value items, fast moving goods, potentially that time to conversion is very short, maybe within a day or even 5 days. So in those scenarios or that kind of products, you could consider a shorter time to conversion, even 5 days or 7 days.
Great, thank you, Aileen. And Udi, we have a question in from Alvin. So it's regarding the effect of a secondary targeter. Are there any preferred attribution models that, I think the question, it says, would more likely demonstrate additional conversions in the net positive scenario? So is that something that you guys have seen?
We like to keep it not too complicated. So in that case, we always recommend that you start with a last click attribution model when you're doing a comparison. There are a few reasons because of that. Number one is if you are doing comparison between two vendors which are similar, like DSPs, the first problem is that not all analytics platforms, they track post view conversions, because it's usually a UTM or a parameter that brings in the data into the attribution. And secondly, if you try to deploy something like even distribution, U-shape, you will still be able to analyze the data, but I would say that there should be sufficient capacity on your side in terms of the analyst or data scientist to be able to understand that if we are using something which is not last click, like U-shape, how do we decide to attribute a system to be more heavy towards early stages versus the last stages of the attribution? If you have that capacity, then for sure try something more sophisticated like even distribution or U-shape. But if you just want to do like a quick check over a couple of months, the last click attribution model is still the best to do.
Got you. I hate clicks, but I understand I understand where you guys are coming from. So Alvin, thank you so much for your question. And the final one that you've touched on, but I think our audience is still sort of trying to understand this. So how much do you think that the universal advertising ID solution can help solve the cookieless challenges ahead?
Yeah, I think it's not going to be a silver bullet again, because There are the first challenges. If you look at the different consortiums trying to come up with a solution, you'll find I think there are 4 leading ones right now. There's one from Trade Desk, one from IAB, there's a solution from LiveRamp, and there's another one. So first of all of them have to agree that 3 of these don't work. I only go for the final one, right? And on top of that, you also have to convince Google and Facebook to adopt this, which, given the history of our industry, I don't know how easy it's going to be. But I believe that, like almost every solution we have in our industry, this is still going to be better than anything we have right now. I would say like 75 to 80% of your attribution challenges will be solved with a universal ID, provided we get there.
Got you. Sounds like we're going to have fun ahead. So with vendors using AI, how much of human support is required to optimize campaigns? Aileen, is that one for you?
Generally, for vendors using AI, using AI, most of the whole campaign monitoring would be done automatically. But having said that, naturally, for AI, because it is based on all the data points that we get day to day, and that's how it builds its intelligence and learn over time, just like a robot. But in the event, if there's any exceptional situation, so for example, let's say now as we're heading to 10/10 or the key shopping season of 11/11, 12/12, potentially the whole user behavior could skew significantly, or the scale of a campaign could differ significantly. Under those circumstances, while the AI is still the main driver behind in making all the decisions, there are occasional settings that we would monitor, and in the event if there is any outlying effect that we see that is not done most efficiently, then there potentially could be some human intervention for such exceptional cases.
Got you. Understood. Well, with 10/10 coming up, I know my shopping behavior is completely unpredictable right now. Well, at least I think maybe it is. So someone has asked, what are your ideas around the topic of incrementally testing to prove that retargeting as a whole or between 2 vendors are driving incremental conversions on top of a client's organic conversions? Who is best placed to take that one? Udi? Is that one for you?
I thought I was on mute. Okay, she was speaking.
Oh.
So generally, there has been increasing interest in the marketplace to ask about incrementality testing or even head-to-head testing as the marketplace gets more crowded with more vendors trying to compete among themselves and to prove the incremental effect. Generally, while in theory that makes sense, generally we are able to run incrementality testing. Most importantly is if we were to consider such a test, it will be very essential for all vendors to be able to evaluate the setup in a fair manner where it's a complete apples to apples comparison. So sometimes during such tests, if the setup were not done exactly in an apples to apples comparison, that could potentially skew the data. And given the current setup, sometimes that may not be possible just due to the fundamental differences in different constraints on different vendor side. But nonetheless, yes, we are able to do incrementality testing. That is something that is possible. It's just that during such tests, we would highly recommend a thorough audit of the entire setup to ensure that we are measuring things in the same way.
Got you. Wonderful. Well, I think we've managed to answer all of the questions from our audience. So Udi, Eileen, I have to thank you so much for your time today, for sharing expertise. Some of you have asked about the deck, and you will be getting that later when we send out our post-webinar survey. But Udi, Eileen, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really do appreciate it, and I hope that you'll join us again sometime soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Perfect.